Reports are emerging that a rift is widening amid growing tension between Prince Harry and King Charles.
Prince Harry had been warned before he entered Windsor. The instruction from William was unmistakable. One subject was not to be raised, one boundary was not to be crossed, and one private family grievance was not to become another confrontation. But inside that closed meeting, Harry ignored him. What followed transformed a tense royal discussion into something far more dangerous. Because when King Charles finally reacted, even William realized his father had reached the end of his patience. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had agreed to the meeting for one purpose: a private conversation that did not collapse into another family battle. Windsor was meant to provide neutral ground. William entered with the same hope, but less confidence. The Prince of Wales, the title given to the monarch's direct heir, already knew how quickly old grievances could overpower reconciliation. Harry understood the risk. Shortly before the meeting, William had spoken to him privately and made one request clear: do not raise the disputed family issue in front of their father. There was no misunderstanding. Yet when the conversation turned tense, Harry leaned forward and brought the subject into the room anyway. William immediately cut in with two quiet words: "Not here." Harry continued. William did not shout. That made the moment worse. His face tightened, his voice dropped, and the future king stared at his brother with the anger of someone realizing that a direct warning had been ignored. Charles watched both sons without interrupting. For a moment, the king said nothing. Then he removed his glasses, placed them beside him, and asked Harry why a private understanding had just been broken. Harry tried to explain that some issues could not be buried simply because they made the family uncomfortable. Charles listened, but the warmth disappeared from his voice. The monarch told him that this meeting had been arranged to rebuild trust, not reopen every wound. If one agreed boundary could not survive a single conversation, then future access, private discussions, and basic confidence between them would have to be reconsidered. William expected that warning to end it. It did not. Harry looked directly at his father and said the real problem was not his refusal to stay silent, but the family's refusal to hear what he believed still needed to be said. Charles stopped moving. William knew instantly that the argument had crossed into something deeper. What Harry said next did not merely challenge William's warning. It forced Charles to decide whether he was speaking as a wounded father or as the king. The Windsor confrontation was never only about one forbidden subject. Beneath Harry's defiance stood years of resentment. Behind William's warning stood exhaustion. And behind Charles's fury was something even more painful: the realization that every attempt to bring his sons into the same room seemed to reopen wounds rather than close them. This was a family meeting involving three men bound by blood, but each entered Windsor carrying a completely different idea of loyalty. Charles felt that difference immediately. The king wanted stability inside his family, because private trust affected more than emotion. It shaped whether difficult conversations could happen without becoming crises. For him, the monarchy, the institution built around the sovereign and the royal duties surrounding the crown, could survive disagreement, but it could not function if personal promises meant nothing. Harry's decision therefore struck at something beyond etiquette. William carried another burden. He remembered the brother who had once stood beside him through grief, duty, and scrutiny, yet he now lived with the pressure of becoming the future king. That position meant every family rupture could eventually become his responsibility. He wanted Harry heard, but he also feared that endless confrontation would make genuine repair impossible. Harry felt trapped by that logic. Before the meeting, William had spoken to him quietly in a Windsor corridor and asked for one thing: keep the disputed grievance out of the room. Harry listened without interrupting. He gave no argument, no warning, no sign that he intended to resist. William walked away believing his brother understood. Harry saw the exchange differently. To him, the restriction felt less like protection and more like another condition on honesty. He believed a conversation about reconciliation could not be real if the most painful subjects were fenced off before anyone sat down. That resentment followed him into Windsor, even as Charles believed the warning had been accepted. Charles already knew about the boundary. William had told his father beforehand that he intended to speak to Harry personally, and the monarch supported it because he thought one brother might reach the other where officials could not. More importantly, William had defended holding the meeting at all, when others around Charles questioned whether another attempt was worth the risk. That history made the rupture personal. Charles eventually stepped away to collect himself, leaving the brothers facing each other in silence. William did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Harry and said, "I asked you for one thing." Harry stared back and offered no apology. But Harry's refusal did not begin at Windsor, because weeks earlier another exchange had created the very warning he would eventually choose to ignore. Every royal rupture has a point people later identify as the moment everything changed. For William and Harry, it came before Windsor, during a private telephone conversation that began carefully and ended with neither brother willing to surrender. One sentence from Harry convinced William that their next meeting needed strict boundaries. One response from William convinced Harry that those boundaries represented something deeper. From that exchange came the warning, and from that warning came the confrontation. William had already noticed how fragile their communication had become. Conversations that once might have felt natural now required caution, because every unresolved grievance threatened to pull them backward. The prince wanted the upcoming Windsor meeting to focus on rebuilding personal contact. Windsor itself mattered because Charles hoped the royal residence could provide neutral ground, away from ceremony, advisors, and the pressures surrounding official palace business. Harry changed everything during a private phone call days before the meeting. He told William that he intended to raise a painful dispute about how earlier family conflicts had been handled. William immediately objected. Charles had agreed to attend on the clear understanding that the conversation would focus on what came next, not become another examination of every past wound. William grew firmer when Harry challenged him. The future king said reconciliation could not survive if each attempt became another reckoning. Harry answered that reconciliation meant very little if difficult truths were forbidden before anyone even entered the room. Neither brother shouted, but the restraint made the disagreement sharper. William heard defiance. Harry heard control. Harry ended the call feeling that his brother had chosen institutional order over genuine honesty. William ended it convinced that the Duke of Sussex, the title Harry retained after stepping back from working royal duties, was confusing freedom to speak with freedom from consequence. Their disagreement was no longer about one subject. It had become a deeper argument about who controlled the terms of family contact. William made the warning unmistakable afterward. In a private written message, he repeated the boundary: "Do not raise that dispute at Windsor." Harry read it, and left the message unanswered for several minutes. Then came the choice that would shape everything. Harry eventually put down his phone and decided that if the disputed subject emerged naturally, he would not avoid it simply because his brother had demanded silence. William knew nothing about that decision, so when Harry entered Windsor, reconciliation already carried a hidden fracture. Charles believed both sons understood the purpose. William believed his warning had worked. Harry had quietly decided otherwise. And once the forbidden subject finally entered the room, William no longer had the luxury of wondering whether Harry would respect his warning. The answer was sitting directly in front of him. Charles had allowed Harry to speak. He had listened through the first interruption, endured the tension between his sons, and resisted the temptation to end the meeting before it collapsed. But restraint has a limit. When Harry defended ignoring William's warning by insisting that certain truths could no longer be contained, something in the king changed. His frustration was no longer hidden beneath ceremony. The father disappeared behind the sovereign, and Charles made unmistakably clear that the line had been crossed. Charles turned back to the question Harry had tried to escape. "Why attend under one understanding?" he asked, then deliberately break the boundary William had communicated. The king was no longer debating the grievance itself. He was challenging the decision behind it. A private family meeting mattered because trust was the only thing separating honest disagreement from another public rupture. Harry refused to accept that framing. He insisted he had never promised silence on something he believed was essential. William answered immediately, reminding him of the phone call and the written message that followed. The prince's warning had not been vague. It had been impossible to mistake. William stood. He told Harry the argument was no longer about the disputed past but about respecting a clear request made before the meeting began. Harry rose too, his frustration hardening into defiance. Charles ordered both sons to sit down. Neither moved at first. Then the king struck the table once with the flat of his hand. The sound ended the standoff. Charles told Harry that disagreement was not betrayal. But knowingly entering a conversation while intending to break its terms was something else. The sovereign, the monarch acting in his formal role as head of the crown, was now speaking with the force of authority, not merely hurt. Charles then disclosed something Harry had not expected. He had resisted advice to postpone the Windsor meeting altogether. Others had questioned whether another attempt was wise. Yet the king had insisted Harry should be given another chance, because direct family dialogue still mattered to him. Harry absorbed that in silence, but Charles was not finished. He said future access to sensitive family discussions depended on confidence, that private arrangements would remain private, and agreed limits would be honored. Without that, trust could not survive. Harry finally looked at his father and asked whether keeping royal peace now required him to pretend the past had never happened. William understood instantly. The argument had just moved beyond one warning, one meeting, and one grievance. Yet the decisive question was no longer who had won the argument. It was who possessed the authority to determine what happened after it. Anger had dominated the room, but anger alone could not determine what came next. Charles still saw a son standing before him. William saw something else as well, a pattern that, unless confronted, would repeat every time another private conversation was offered. And so the balance inside Windsor shifted. The king's fury had exposed the problem, but it was the future king who began defining the consequence, and Harry immediately understood that his brother was no longer asking. William knew exactly where he stood. As Harry's brother, he carried years of shared history, private grief, and memories no palace rule could erase. As heir, he also carried responsibility for what came after Charles. The heir is the person next in line to the throne, and for William, that meant family crises could eventually become matters he would have to manage as monarch. Charles hesitated despite his anger. The king did not want to close the door on Harry completely, because punishment was not the same as repair. He still saw the possibility of another conversation, another chance, another route back. But William no longer believed an informal reset could follow every broken agreement, as though nothing had happened. William turned to his father and spoke with deliberate calm. He said another private meeting could not be arranged on trust alone if the terms of this one had been ignored. Harry immediately challenged him, asking whether his brother now intended to decide when he could speak to their father. William answered without raising his voice. This was not about permission, it was about trust. Harry heard judgment in every word. William heard repetition in every objection. The future king then proposed a new condition. Any sensitive family meeting involving Harry would need a clearly agreed agenda beforehand. No surprise grievances. No sudden expansion into disputed subjects once the conversation had begun. The structure was meant to protect dialogue, but to Harry, it felt like another wall. Charles said nothing for several seconds. Then the king reached for the meeting notes, closed the folder without reading another page, and pushed it away. William watched his father instead of Harry. That gesture carried the decision before the words came. Charles agreed. Harry had expected his father's anger to cool. Instead, the monarch endorsed William's boundary and made clear that future conversations would happen under different terms for the foreseeable future. The meeting had begun as an attempt at reconciliation. It ended with trust narrowed, conditions tightened, and all three men understanding that something fundamental had changed. The door had closed on one meeting, but the real consequences began only after Harry stepped outside it. There was no dramatic announcement waiting outside Windsor, no ceremonial punishment, no public decree bearing Harry's name. The consequence was quieter, and therefore far more personal. The meeting that was meant to reopen a family channel had instead narrowed it. Charles was furious. William had stopped negotiating, and Harry now faced a reality he had resisted for years. The possibility that his family would still speak to him, but only through boundaries he no longer had the power to define. Harry carried that reality with him as he left. The Windsor reconciliation effort had failed, and future private conversations involving the same sensitive disputes would now require clear conditions in advance. For the people managing Charles's schedule, that meant greater caution around informal family access. A private audience, simply a confidential meeting with the monarch, could no longer be treated as harmless if old grievances might suddenly consume it. Harry paused before getting into his car. He looked back toward Windsor for several seconds, anger mixing with something harder to admit. He knew he had not merely upset his father. By ignoring William's warning, he had strengthened his brother's argument that trust needed structure, and that realization followed him away from the castle. Charles remained behind after the room emptied. The king did not rage now. Camilla entered later, and found him sitting in silence, the force of the confrontation replaced by exhaustion. He told the queen consort that watching his sons turn every attempt at repair into another collision had become more painful with time. She listened as he admitted that firmness had brought order, but not peace. William felt no victory either. The prince understood that getting his father to enforce boundaries was not the same as rebuilding a relationship. In a private conversation afterward, he admitted that he had wanted clarity, not humiliation. Harry might see the decision as another restriction, but William saw it as the only way to prevent the next meeting from collapsing before it began. Charles began questioning himself once the anger faded. Had he protected the family by standing firm, or had he pushed Harry farther away? The monarch could defend the decision and still fear its cost. That doubt mattered because Charles was no longer deciding only how to manage a difficult meeting. He was deciding how much distance a damaged family could survive. So the king sought William out privately, before either man fully understood what it would cost them in the end. And without Harry, courtiers, or advisors between them, Charles and William finally confronted the question neither had voiced during the argument. What if winning this battle meant losing Harry entirely? After the shouting came silence. Charles and William were left with the consequence of everything that had been said, and everything neither man had dared say in front of Harry. Behind a closed door, father and son abandoned the language of protocol. There were no officials to blame, and no formal rules to hide behind. Charles asked William one painful question. Had they protected the family by standing firm, or had they just made reconciliation even harder? Charles asked his elder son to remain at Windsor after everyone else had gone. No aides stayed behind, and no private secretary remained to shape the conversation. A private secretary is a senior royal aide who manages official correspondence, schedules, and sensitive business. But this discussion belonged to neither office nor ceremony. It belonged to a father and son who were both afraid of losing someone they loved. William answered carefully. The prince told his father that repeated access without dependable boundaries would only create fresh resentment. He did not describe the new conditions as punishment. He described them as protection. Harry could still speak to them, still return, still try again, but not if every meeting began with one purpose and ended in another confrontation. Charles listened, then admitted what his anger had hidden. Every clash with Harry now carried a fear that the conversation might become their last meaningful one. The king could defend the boundary and still dread its cost. His fury at Windsor had not erased his attachment to his younger son. It had exposed how deeply disappointed he was that another chance had failed. William understood more than he wanted to admit. He told Charles that he did not want permanent distance either. The future king remembered the brother who had once shared grief, expectation, and duty with him before adult choices pulled them apart. Harry was not simply a problem to manage. He was family, and that made every necessary boundary hurt more. William offered a compromise. Harry should not be excluded from future family contact, but sensitive conversations had to begin with agreed limits. No assumptions, no surprise confrontations, no pretending that trust could repair itself simply because everyone wanted peace. Charles finally accepted the distinction. The king would not sever contact, but he would not reverse the Windsor decision simply because his anger had cooled. Before William left, Charles reached for the closed folder from the earlier meeting and stopped. He did not reopen it. The next conversation, he said quietly, must be about what can still be built. Then Charles made one final decision. Harry would hear that directly from him. But Windsor's doors could contain the argument only briefly, because soon the outside world began interpreting a private family rupture as a public royal crisis. By the following morning, the Windsor confrontation had escaped the silence surrounding it. The public did not know every sentence spoken inside the meeting, but the central image was irresistible. Charles furious, William drawing a line, and Harry leaving without the reconciliation many had hoped for. Suddenly, a private argument between father and sons became a national conversation about loyalty, forgiveness, hierarchy, and whether the monarchy could ever separate its constitutional future from its deepest family wounds. William saw the first wave of coverage and felt the old frustration return. The prince had wanted boundaries, not another public contest between brothers. Royal hierarchy, the order of rank and responsibility inside the monarchy, now sat at the center of the debate, because commentators treated his warning as evidence of growing authority. Catherine noticed him stop halfway through one report and place his phone face down. She asked nothing. William did not need to explain why it hurt. Harry faced the opposite problem. He saw himself described almost entirely as defiant, while the reason he had raised the disputed subject faded behind the drama of ignoring William's warning. To him, that felt like another loss of control. He had wanted the family to confront what he believed remained unresolved. Instead, the public discussion focused on whether he had broken trust. That imbalance deepened his resentment, because argument about trust now eclipsed the grievance he carried. Outside Windsor Castle, the private rupture became public spectacle. A small crowd gathered near the public approach, as television crews broadcast throughout the morning. One newspaper front page carried photographs of Charles, William, and Harry, beneath the blunt headline, "Windsor Breaking Point." The phrase spread quickly because it reduced years of family tension to one sharp moment. A father furious, one son drawing limits, and another refusing to accept them. Charles refused to feed the storm. The king was urged to authorize a detailed response, but he chose silence instead. Buckingham Palace, the monarch's principal official residence and administrative center, would not turn a family argument into a prolonged public war. His restraint mattered because every official sentence could harden positions that were already painfully fragile. William understood the decision. Harry noticed it too. Neither man could know exactly what Charles would do next, but both recognized that silence from the monarch was not indifference. It was preparation. Charles had already begun composing a private message to Harry. The king wanted no courtier carrying it, no spokesman interpreting it, and no brother delivering another warning. This time, the meaning would come directly from father to son. The final word would therefore not come from a headline, a courtier, or William. It would come from the father whose anger had started the crisis. Charles's anger had been unmistakable, but anger was never going to be the final judgment. After Windsor, the king faced a choice far more difficult than losing his temper: whether to punish Harry through permanent distance, or preserve a relationship under terms neither son could misunderstand again. His decision was neither surrender nor exile. It was a boundary. And in making it, Charles finally separated two things the family had repeatedly confused: love between relatives and trust between people who must keep their word. Charles chose to speak directly. The king sent Harry a private message, making one point absolutely unmistakable: their relationship was not being severed. He remained his son, personal contact remained possible, and the door was not being permanently closed. But the Windsor decision would stand. Future sensitive meetings would require clearly agreed subjects and conditions before anyone entered the room. Harry read the message alone and felt the first surge of frustration immediately. The restrictions still felt like proof that his voice came with conditions. Yet as he read again, another painful truth settled in. Ignoring William's warning had not forced the family to confront the disputed grievance. It had convinced Charles that future conversations needed stronger safeguards. The consequence was not exile. It was diminished trust. William received no victory from that outcome. When Charles later spoke with him privately, the monarch made clear that the boundary was never to become a weapon between brothers. The prince agreed. His purpose had not been to defeat Harry or claim authority over him. He had wanted to stop another fragile attempt at reconciliation from collapsing under the weight of another surprise confrontation. Charles finally understood his own fury more clearly. The king had not exploded simply because Harry disobeyed a warning. His anger had carried years of disappointment, hope, and fear. Windsor had been meant to prove that private trust could still survive between them. Instead, the meeting demonstrated that love alone could not make trust automatic. Harry was not cast out. William was not declared the winner. Charles did not erase the possibility of another conversation. What changed was the price of returning to that room: reliability, restraint, and action strong enough to rebuild confidence over time. Charles stood after his final conversation with William and left the closed meeting folder where it rested. He did not reopen it. He did not revise the decision. The argument was finished, and the boundary remained. Windsor did not repair a fractured family that day. It accomplished something harsher but necessary. Charles chose peace with boundaries over reconciliation without trust. And for Harry and William, that became the final lesson of the meeting. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.